race, from the same place, that make the same trip, on the same ship. So we must push one common intention, it's for a better life in the region, for we women and we children. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean and the Caribbean and the Caribbean.
And welcome to today's edition of Politics 101, our open word edition. Professor Clive Thomas and Dr. Dennis Canterbury. Somebody said, well, Dr. Hines, you say Professor Thomas and Dr. Dennis Canterbury. Is there a difference between the two? Well, look, we've been calling Professor Thomas Professor for as long as I remember it, and so we don't want to get our wires crossed according to the young people. So we want to leave Professor with the Professor. Dr. Canterbury doesn't mind it. So Dr. Canterbury and myself are professors and so on. But when we say Professor Thomas, it's more a Guyanese, West Indian kind of thing. It's more a generational thing more than anything else. So yes, Professor Thomas and Dr. Dennis Canterbury are going to be here today, and we are going to be weighing in on the issues of the day, always with the eye of the political economist, with the eye of the political economist. And as you know, on this program, we endeavor to do, among other things, to teach. We can't help doing that. We have to do that. It is very important in terms of throwing ideas out, discussing ideas, because I've been reminded over and over again, there is no real successful movement without big ideas. And that goes without saying, whether it's whether it's apartheid and fascism on the one hand, or whether it's progressive politics, socialism, regional integration. We have to have big ideas. And as you all know, I have been saying for the last couple of weeks that there is talk of elections, and we are not anti-election, but we always raise the question of whether in effect the election would lead to transformation, whether it will lead to something progressive in the society. So we're always keeping an eye on the electoral architecture. And you know that our electoral architecture in Guyana needs a lot of repairing. And so we keep an eye on that, but we also don't want to give the impression that we are anti-election, that we are not interested in election. As I said, we have a couple of big ideas. The cash transfer, the Buxton proposal, universal basic income. It's about the single big idea that has been thrown out there in the last decade or so. And everyone that I talk to agrees with that. I was making the point last week that somebody probably tried a hoax or something and said they were giving cash transfers at Freedom House. And, hundreds of people turned up there, including supporters of the opposition. Well, mostly supporters of the opposition. But it shows us the idea of cash transfers has really become part of the thinking of our people. Of course, the PPP has really made a mess of it. They have simplified it and so forth. They've turned it into handouts and so on and so forth. But when we in the WPA, when we talk about cash transfer, when we talk about the universal basic income, we're really talking about something that's structured, something that is a means to an end, and the end is the alleviation of poverty. And we are talking about it being enshrined in law. So it's not a government going around and sharing out thing. And it's a big idea. And one of the things that we have learned is that more and more there are political parties and political leaders who have embraced it to some extent and differently and so forth. But I have argued that insofar as governance is concerned, that we would want to be at the table in order to ensure that we can deliver on that policy, that we can deliver. And we embrace the idea of shared governance. In the old days, we called it power sharing, and some of us still do. I prefer power sharing than shared governance. But we embrace that idea that no single party has all the answers. And different parties will emphasize different things. And we recognize that among the political parties, we are most consistent and passionate about this issue of poverty alleviation, hence our embrace of the universal basic income, our advancing of the Buxton proposal, which has been on the table since 2018. And I have argued that we would want to be at the table after an election to deliver that to the country. And so, you know, it's a big idea that we have embraced. We have also recognized that the issue of education is another important area that we embrace. Of course, education, all political parties recognize that education is important. We invoke our old manifesto intervention that there's need for a state of emergency in education, because we see education as not just being one thing. The teachers' strike has brought into focus the importance of education and the multifaceted nature of it. And if we start with the teachers in terms of wages and salaries, and we say that if we are able to pay our teachers well, then we attract some of our best students coming out of high school, coming out of university. We attract more of them to the teaching profession. And if we pay them well, then we are able to keep them in Guyana. That if they're paid $1,800 here and they're paid $1,800 in the Bahamas, I'm sure most of the teachers will prefer to stay here. So the wages and salaries, if we start there, that then allows us to explore the other aspects of education. And then we link the Buxton proposal to education, because, you know, they are conditional and unconditional cash transfers. We have examples of the cash transfers being linked to school attendance, being linked to attendance to clinics, health, and so forth. So there's a way in which the cash transfer, the Buxton proposes, link and can be linked to education. And so therefore, the cash transfer, the Buxton proposal, universal basic income, you take your pick on, or whatever you want to call it. A lot of people call it the $5,000 cash transfer. That, along with education, I would say, is where we in the Working People's Alliance start in terms of where we want to go policy-wise. Of course, in terms of the oil and gas industry, we also have ideas. I mean, Professor Thomas has put forward the idea that we need a national oil company. that can go in there and bid, for example, for blocks and so forth. And we haven't heard anybody pick up that idea. So there are areas of the political economy of Guyana that we in the WPA have been thinking about and articulating. And we link that to education by saying that we are probably evolving into a politics, evolving into a governance structure where we put meat to the idea that more of us at the table will ensure a breadth of policies, and that it is not that we are not interested in other areas, but there may be other political parties that are passionate about those areas and may want to advocate more for those than other parties. So the whole notion of coalition government comes into play. And people normally ask, well, what this party bring to the table and what the party bring to the table. And a lot of time they mean what votes you bring to the table. But equally important is what policies you bring to the table. And what policies you bring to the table that can be translated into development, human development, for example, because we've been talking a lot about that, and President Lula shone the light on that, human development, not as opposed to infrastructure development, but the marrying of human development with infrastructural development. And I think that's an area that we would discuss a little bit as we go forward, because we are not anti-infrastructure. And note I use the term marrying infrastructural development with human development. So it's not infrastructural development as an end in itself, that infrastructural development itself can be humanized. All right, you have heard a little bit there of the WP, and I'm responding to many of you who have expressed some frustration at us in the WPA of not being forthcoming where we stand on electoral politics. Are we interested in government and so on? And I want to say we are a normal political party, and we are interested in government. We are not anti-elections. We do have policies. We do have things that we want to do for the country. And so I just wanted to begin to speak to those questions that a lot of you have thrown in my direction, and to say we are a normal political party and we are interested in elections, we are interested in policies, we are interested in helping to develop our country in a practical way. So we're not just a party of ideas, we're also a party of the implementation of ideas. You construct ideas, and then you seek how to implement those ideas. Okay, so I think we're ready. Welcome to Politics 101. If you're joining us from outside of Guyana, if you're joining us from inside Guyana, welcome. And we have quite a lot to talk about, but as usual, time, is not always on our side. But we want to touch on the teachers, the teacher struggle. As you notice, the talks of collapse, the court mandated the mediation, and the government, of course, was quite bizarre, agreeing on the first day that they are going to consider the timeline 2019 to the present. The CEO got up, took 2 hours, came back and said, yes, the government agrees. And then by the end of the day, the government says, no, it doesn't agree. It wants to do wage talks from 2024, and arguing that it does not have the fiscal space, meaning it doesn't have the money in the present budget to consider salary increases from 2019. And so we're going to talk about that with Professor Thomas and Dr. Canterbury. We are also going to look at that Chevron Exxon thing on, I think it's the Lisa block, and things are heating up there. They're moving to arbitration. So that's something we are keeping an eye on, and we'll get our professor to weigh in on that, what that means, what are the implications, etc. And further afield in Haiti, significant developments in Haiti. Really, that country continues on the brink. The prime minister has resigned, and they are in the process of setting up an interim administration to prepare for elections. And you all know that I have expressed my hesitation about going to an election without creating the kind of stability in the society that is needed for an election to make sense. And it seems as though they are leaning in that direction. And CARICOM had a meeting in Jamaica, and it was attended by the American Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken, and they seem to be making some small movements. We are going to be talking about that because, of course, Haiti is part of CARICOM. We have had the clear and present problem of Haitian migrants into CARICOM countries and the way they've been treated by CARICOM governments, and that remains a sore point. But Haiti remains an issue that is so important. I remember in 1979, being on the streets with the WP and hearing Walter Rodney talk about the fear that Guyana could become like Haiti, and here we are 40 odd years later. And when we look at what's going on in Haiti, the destruction of the institutions, no proper security force, no proper government, the institutions have all broken down, and really the taking over of the country by gangs. And you are wondering whether Guyana could not walk in that direction. Of course, Haiti is poverty, Guyana is plenty. And because of the plenty in Guyana and the lack of a responsible government, and a government that is prepared to disobey all the norms, whether you call them democratic norms or whatever you call them, a government that is prepared to disregard all those norms, a government that is prepared to antagonize teachers over salary. You're wondering if we could not face a similar breakdown. Of course, if governments would say, to prevent the breakdown, they are going to go after citizens. And you heard Jack Dio and Babajan threatening to go after citizens, and so forth. Anyhow, here we are. Welcome to our Open Word edition of Politics 101. You've had enough of me. Let me bring in my co-host and guest, Professor Clive Thomas and Dr. Dennis Canterbury. Professor Thomas, Dr. Canterbury, welcome.
Welcome, David. Thanks.
Good evening, David.
Thank you. And this is the month of March. This is the month of March, and it's a month. It's a month of the Grenadian Revolution, 1979. 45 years later, 41 years after its demise. It's March 13, and of course, March 8, International Women's Day. So it's a really a month that has significance for especially people on the progressive side of politics in the Caribbean. And I know we hadn't planned this, but I would like us to start with some reflection on the Grenadian Revolution, because it continues, as some have argued, it continues to live with us. Revolutions are by their very nature regional and global events. That's why you don't have revolutions every day and every year. And the Grenadian Revolution was the first of its kind in our English-speaking Caribbean. And there are lots of debates about the revolution itself, about what happened during the revolution and after the revolution. And, I go to conferences, and it never goes away, because every time the issue of Grenada is raised, the raw emotions. I've seen people cry, cuss up each other, and this is at academic conferences on the issue of Grenada, which means it's still raw. It's still raw. And Professor Thomas, I know that you had you had a particular attitude to the Grenadian Revolution. I remember the day I came out of prison in 1983, June. They take me to see the doctor, and then after the doctor, they took me to the WPA office, and then you picked me up from there and dropped me off at the residence, and we were talking, because I hadn't spoken to you in over 3 years. And I remember you talking about this notion of bourgeois democracy, and you saying to me that, look, there's nothing, these things that we are calling bourgeois democracy, the right to free speech, the right to assembly, the right to a living wage, the right to work. These are not bourgeois democracy. These are things that our people fought and died for. And it's not bourgeois democracy. It belongs to us. And that's one of the things that has stayed with me and that has informed my own praxis going forward. Because as a young hothead, socialist, anti-West, anti-capitalist, I had bought in to the bourgeois democracy argument, and it was sobering the way in which you explained it that day to me, and it lived with me to this day. To this day, you had a Jeep in those days, and I remember it. Your reflections on the Grenadian Revolution 40 odd years later.
Well, I would say you have touched on the most important point, or philosophical point I've gathered from that event, which is that we can't try to miniaturize the importance of freedom of any type, because remember, our ancestry was slavery. We were chattel slaves. So the right to free expression, the right to independent thought, the right to assemble, all these are rights that were in it to our struggles at that point in time. They were never appendages that came from above or came from the colonizers. So I wanted Caribbean people to realize, as descendants of slaves, we had an innate tendency to fight for those things. So which meant that we don't want people in this region to want to give up on democracy and say it's bourgeois, and other people to come from having the rights of free personhood and so forth in their own countries, fighting alongside us and telling us that they are different from us. They are as good and as important as us in the way in which we are situated in the struggle. And I felt that we had given some of the supporters of the radical tradition from the metropole, or I would call them imperialists, too much of a scope in determining the outcome, because it was they who were framing it. as bourgeois this and bourgeois that. So I try to make sure that the struggle for democracy, for Ghana's representative government, and all that was rooted in the demands and the social experiences of Ghana and the Caribbean. So that was the thrust of it.
That was the thrust of it. And I remember, like I said, it was in June of 1983. The revolution had not yet imploded, and as I said, you would pick me up at the WPA office and you were dropping me to Andaye's residence. I remember it was about 2 o'clock in the day, and it was sobering for me.
I think monthly review had published that quite a
Yes.
famous mistake.
Yes. Dr. Canterbury, the Grenadian Revolution, as you look back on it, what is there a lesson? Are there linkages to the present? What?
Yes, just to as an adjoinder to what was already said, I think that when we look at when we pose the question, what was the cause of it? Why Morris Bishop and the NGM decided that it was necessary for them to win power or to take power in Grenada. And it comes right back to the question, as CY pointed out, they were operating in a situation where democracy was under serious challenge. And it was necessary for them to strive to restore or bring about some sense of democracy, because people are not going to sit idly by and allow their democratic rights to be trampled upon. They're going to respond in different ways. And Grenada was an example. The NGM was an example of how they decided to respond to the fact that Eric Gary was not behaving in a democratic way, especially towards his political opponents. And once you're not going to be treating your opponents with the level of respect that they should be treated with, then you can expect, and you treat them in an undemocratic way. You try to create things like the Mongoose Squad, and you try to suppress them. You try to take away their votes. You bring in all kinds of spiritual and other forms of UFO voodoo into the process. Then people are going to respond. And I think that even in our own country, in Guyana, people should be wary of the fact that once people are oppressed, once the democracy is taken away from them, then people are going to push back. So in the case of Grenada, it was so the cause of it, the undemocratic behavior of the government that forced those young men, Morris Bishop and others, to win power. And then what was the reason or the cause for the demise of the revolution? And one of the things as we go to segue into Haiti, that we should never, ever forget about the Caribbean is the role of foreign institutions in the region and foreign powers. And in the same way that Morris Bishop and others were faced with building a democratic society, a people's democracy, because this question of democracy, even notions of bourgeois democracy, etc., they're not really settled on what democracy is. There's so many kinds of democracy, as you know, David. I remember once when I was working with some people from China, and they said, we have Chinese democracy. And some people say, oh, you are not democratic, you're dictatorial. They say, no, we're democratic. So democracy is not just Jeffersonian democracy. Democracy is not just the British type 51% type Westminster democracy. So you can have Grenadian democracy in the way that Morris and others were trying to do it. So that revolution there was put to a halt by external forces. and over ideological issues such as the ideological divide between the East and West at the time. But all they were trying to do is build a society that was within the framework and within the cultural experiences of the people of Grenada.
Thank you very much, Dr. Canterbury. Dr. Thomas, in my introduction, I spoke a little bit about elections and the WPA's attitude to elections, and I have been forced to respond to that because there are some people who are not uncomfortable with us politically, but are not sure where our parties stand on the question of elections, because we tend to talk about the need for proper electoral arrangements as a means of producing elections that can be transformative, and we do not necessarily say elections at all costs, and that apparently is causing some confusion among people who kind of look to us for guidance and to think that we are not necessarily interested in elections. And I want to take you back to the Grenadian Revolution, because the debate as whether the Grenadian revolutionary government should have held elections was one that was raging, and you came down on a particular side on that issue of election, and you got some castigating from fellow travelers on the left, and I wanted to go there for you to talk about the WPA's attitude to elections. So if you can respond to the WPA's attitude to elections, taking a cue from way back there in the revolution.
Well, I think every electoral right that we've got in Guyana or anywhere else in the Caribbean has been earned, and therefore it should be fought and kept by people. It has never been a gift of the other forces that are attacking the region or trying to exploit it. These are gains of real struggle, and we must give them the priority they deserve. So it's always a starting point for me that whatever gains we've made in terms of democratic development, whatever other gains we made in terms of more progressive development, we fight to keep. We never resile ourselves from that. We hold on to that as gains we've earned because they've been paid for by blood, sweat, and tears, as they say. So that's always a starting point. And I think that's the attitude we should keep and we should embrace. And because I think the ways in which some of the political forces see political opposition, to my mind, carries a lot of dangers in it. I stumbled upon a display by one of the leading PPP protagonists, Vice President Jack Joe, by accident on the television. And I was alarmed at the brazen malevolence of everything that he said. It was, I actually thought it was an AI animated version of himself that was speaking. I honestly thought it was the first exploration of AI politics in Guyana, because the attitude and the facial expression, the malevolence and the brutality and the crudeness of the presentation, the snares and all of that, I thought came from an artificially intelligent photography. And it was a total abuse against people just because they're not like him or different from him, just because they're not supporters of him or in his party. We can't allow that type of politics be normalized in this country, because if some of us won't stand for it. We can't have a vice president speaking that way about teachers, speaking that way about the opponents in this country who are citizens. the demeaning posture was really unbelievable. I could not believe this is what politics has become now.
So you know,
Yeah,
see why,
from mind. What's that?
as you were speaking, I was thinking exactly in that direction, but in a different sense, but in the same way, because when you said that we've had a history of struggle, we didn't get democracy on a pedestal. We didn't get, no one gave it to us. We had a fight.
Every trade union right we fight for.
We had a fight
That
for
we
it.
got to fight for.
And what struck me was that some people are trying to say that it's not our fight for these things, but there was someone who was the soul of the nation. I was shocked when I saw that.
No, the soul of the nation was crafted by Jagan and the PPP. That is what bold me. That is beyond artificial intelligence.
So we what's the role of the struggle?
One of the most vicious exposures I've ever seen of what I would call petty politics at its most petty.
Yeah.
See why? Sight to behold.
Yeah. See why? And I think this takes me back to come forward again. You published what I consider to be one of the most important books in post-colonial Guyana and Caribbean, and that is The Rise of the Authoritarian State in the Periphery, published in 1984. And I think I know that book almost cover to cover because I use it as my theoretical guide for both my master's thesis and doctoral dissertation because I was dealing with the whole question of democracy and authoritarianism in those two studies. And one of the seminal points you made there is that authoritarianism doesn't have any one ideological home. That authoritarianism, you have it on the right and you have it on the left. And we are living in a Guyana today in which authoritarianism and electoral malpractice, electoral rigging, at least from the PPP standpoint, is confined to one party, to one group, and that other parties and other groups are incapable of authoritarianism, are incapable of rigging election because they're progressive. You could not rig election because you are the party of Chedi Jagan. You could not be an authoritarian government because you are a PPP government, a government of a party that is rooted in the working class. You cannot be, according to Jack Dio and those people, you cannot be authoritarian. You cannot rig election. I want you to expound on that issue of authoritarianism and its boundary. It's boundaryless. Meaning that there are no boundaries to authoritarianism.
And there are no boundaries and there are no limitations in terms of race or any other factor. It's an attitude and a style of behavior, which I think is partly explained by personality factors, family upbringing or growing up, cultural exposure to the wider society, and also by the dogma that the group supports to rationalize their position within the structure of the politics in the society. They believe that they are a ruling group and that they've generated some level of legitimacy for that status. And therefore, they have some rights of occupancy. And they also have some rights of having had the status of reaching there, and therefore rights of continuance in that status. So as far as they're concerned, it's both hereditary, in terms of the context, current context, it's also existential currently, And in terms of inheritance from the past, it's a legacy. And I think it distorts their politics. It distorts the way in which they perceive and portray issues in the country. And I think ultimately, and I think most damaging of all, it causes them to misjudge the people that they have to deal with. I won't even call them opponents, because very often they're not opponents. They're just people having different ideas and views than you. They make them into opponents. And that's for the purpose of vilification and miniaturization, because they lack the authority and strength of the views that they hold. They stumble upon them, and they rule out of that stumble. They come with no real coordination and real planning or understanding of the society. They don't even give it a second thought. It's pure reflexive behavior. That is why it comes across so crude.
Yes, yes, yes.
And you see, I think that this attitude, we could, when the Constitution, the 1980 Constitution, we saw it as authoritarian. But then when they won in 92, they're the ones, this is along the lines that you're talking about there, David, that you see happening now. But since then, they said it wasn't the Constitution, it was who was in power. And if they're in power, then it's okay for the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
So we can't be authoritarian. But we're saying the Constitution.
Yeah.
You know, this is what Jagan did in if you remember in 92, because he campaigned against the Constitution, but then now when he got into power, he says, oh no, it's not the Constitution, it's how we're going to operate within this Constitution, and we're going to be democratic. We're not going to operate the Constitution as authoritarians, right?
Yeah, and I do remember Dennis and Clive when around that 1979-80 time, as they were discussing the constitutional change that Burnham was and the PNC were about to implement. I remember Kwayana putting in my hand the PPP's proposal for the independence constitution. And I was shocked at the similarities between their constitutional proposal in the 1960s and the so-called Burnham Constitution. And I stumbled on the copy of that thing the other day, and I lost it again. I stumbled on it, I was searching for something, and I still do have it, but it's amazing the kind of hypocrisy that passed. Let's move to the teachers, the development in the teachers' situation. We know that they moved, mediated talks, and no sooner they began to talk, the talks collapsed because the government said that they cannot consider salaries, raising salaries and wages from 2019 to the present, that they want to start negotiation from 2024. The teachers union, of course, walked out, and the matter is now going back to the court, and we have the threat of perhaps a resumption of the strike. Professor Thomas, you first, and then I'll go to Dr. Canterbury. Are you surprised? Are you all surprised at this development, this attitude on the part of the government?
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm totally surprised. I somehow or the other had a feeling that they would never accept the equality on the other side of the table as represented by the GTU. That was my feeling personally. But what I see coming out of it is almost a personal contempt for the GTU. It's almost as how dare these people. It's almost a feeling that they don't have a right to stand and bargain with me.
Mm-hmm.
Master Day in full flight. That's what it sounds like to me. So I was I'm now totally disappointed because it's going to take a humongous effort on the part of the court to put us back on course. All the excuses the government is giving, I think, are really very puerile, because ultimately they can make an agreement where they set a starting date for payments into the next budget or supplementary budget, or they make some adjustments with it drawing down from the natural resource fund. All and many arrangements can be made to satisfy the payments later on. But the important thing is to get through the negotiations to arrive at a settlement that both parties are comfortable with. And there's no question of fiscal space determining or preventing that outcome from happening now, because it doesn't have to say the date will be implemented as of the 4th of March or April or even May or June. You can always set a date for full implementation of the process. So I think they're copping out, and I think that they're copping out because they feel that the teachers now are their weakest point, having gone back in. And it'd be hard for them to start again. So to me, it's a brazen, naked exercise of the attitude that I told you that I thought I saw being displayed out of artificial intelligence earlier. That's the only explanation I could give for what I've seen. But none of the arguments make sense.
None of it makes sense. Dennis?
Yes, I support everything that CY just said there, because when I looked at what from the Chronicle, for example, if you look at the Chronicle and you see the way they reported it, you get the impression, if you were only to read that, you get the impression that the unions just walked out. So the teacher union disrespected the process and they walked out. Whereas the truth of the matter is that they're the ones who reneged on the whole situation. The real cause of what happened was them, because they agreed to do one thing, and then when you get them to the table and the people are off from the strike, they're back at work, then they could bring their dirty tricks. This is just a piece of they even changed the negotiator.
Yes.
Yeah, they brought in a new negotiator. And
New
the one
negotiator.
before didn't seem to know.
Yeah, and I remember that kind of tactics that these fellas use with us, where you don't know who you're really negotiating with. Because today you negotiate with this person, and then some higher up, because they send a permanent secretary now, then next time they might send a junior minister. So you don't really know who is the true decision maker in the process. This is the other thing to consider here. Who could really make a decision?
Imagine how could a government treat its own employees that way?
Exactly.
I mean, if it's a war game you're playing, I could understand.
And that's how they're behaving, as if it's a war game. So the union really is in a pickle, in the sense that they could play those kinds of dirty tricks, like changing negotiators. You meet an agreement, and then you don't know if that's the real agreement, because some higher authority comes in and say, well, they don't have the power to make this agreement. All of those things we experienced in the past. So it's not surprising.
Yeah, as Dr. Thomas says, it will take a humongous effort on the part of the court. And I think that is an important factor going forward. We will see how the court responds to this, because it's the court mediation, court-ordered mediation, and we will see how the court responds to this. Professor Thomas, the Chevron, ExxonMobil tug-of-war over the Lisa block continues. It's now going to arbitration, no?
Yes, and they expect it to be completed by the second quarter of next year. That's the forecast. Most commentators are signaling at this point in time.
What should we in Guyana, we Guyanese, from our standpoint, what should we be looking for in this old?
What we should have been looking for is that since it's concerning Guyana oil, we should have had some regulatory input into the matter. But we apparently had none. So I don't know. All these things happening around us. That's why we need a national oil company.
Yeah.
But the government clearly doesn't own anything.
Yeah.
Or even, and although it doesn't own anything, it doesn't seem to be regulating every single aspect of the operations of the oil exploration and development. It doesn't seem to be intimately involved in that process. Because how could the asset change hands when the regulatory authorities in the states, in the country, I think it's in France, where the negotiation will be arbitrated.
Dr.
And
Thomas,
being Guyana play no role in it.
Yeah, no, I take your comments very, very seriously because you are not one of the deniers. You are not hard on the government on on a lot of these issues. You're quite even-handed, but here you are saying that the government has not really played its regulatory role, and and you have put forward the proposal of a national oil company as one of the means of dealing with some of
well, I'm trying to create an interest through the company.
Yeah.
In the details of the operations of the firms as they stand now, that goes beyond the government, because the government is incapable of handling all these matters. So you have to have some institution that is organically linked to the operations day by day, that have an interest in their outcome, because that's their survival, that's their livelihood, that's the means by which they deliver to Ghana. If we don't have those forces at play, we can't do anything.
We can't do anything. You heard it here in Politics 101, the Open Word Edition, Professor Clive Thomas again raising the question of a national oil company. And that goes beyond the fact that the government owns, that there's a state-owned company that's in the process, but it will pick up the slack from where clearly the government is out of its depth. And we say government, but of course this is the vice president who seems to be calling all the shots. And it's a very dangerous development going forward. And so therefore they call the proposal for a national oil company is something that we have to put on the front burner and argue very, very, very strongly for. It should become, if you will, an issue today. But if must be going to the elections, I hear people are asking the political parties where they stand on renewing the contract, where they stand on this, where they stand on that. Where do they stand on a national oil company? And I don't see them discussing it. Professor, give us an example of where one country or a couple of countries where there's a national oil company that, in a sense, does what you are envisaging such a company would do for
almost all the Middle Eastern countries, all of them have national oil companies. That's how they have sought to exercise and extend their role. It's a Qatari company that we are hoping to bring here. It's a national company. It is the national company that helped to form OPEC. It is that sort of generation that you have to expect. There are national companies in important countries like India, places like that, the Philippines and so on. That's where we have to try to extend the role and influence of our ownership into the actual operations and ownership of the companies. You have to affect the decision-making at the level where it is most important. That is where the companies are incorporated and where they make decisions that they have to in terms of company law. And so we have to become a player in that context. We can't sit down here and wait on civil servants to make decisions on these important matters.
Dennis, any input here?
Yeah, I of course agree with what CY was saying there, and also I would like to say that that Hess is actually digging in its critique of Exxon, claiming that Exxon has actually misread and they're misinterpreting the contract and the particular clause of the contract, but there seems to be in some sections of the literature that when these oil companies have disputes such as the ones between Chevron and Exxon, there are different scenarios in terms of how these disputes are resolved. And one of the ways that these disputes are resolved is by having the regulators come in to help to resolve it. And it brings us to Guyana, whether or not they have the capacity to intervene in such a dispute. They're not even involved. All of this is taking place above their heads. And the arbitration is going on in Paris, rather than the government being able to step in as regulator to say, hey, look, this is how we might address this issue and help to bring about a solution to it. But it's taking place completely outside of the grasp of the government and the regulators. So indeed, this notion of a national oil company is something that could help address issues such as these with disputes. And not only with disputes, but I also look at it from a labor perspective in terms of the skills, managerial, and other kinds of developments that can take place with the locals. This is developing rather than focusing on the local content, or not just that, but also with a national company, you could have the kind of skill development. You could have a lot of inputs from labor within this process, so that we can now not necessarily just be totally dependent on importing skills. So it has a lot of implications if you were to have a national oil company.
Implications.
I saw somewhere, David, but I haven't. I can't recall the source right now. That so far, Guyana got $100,000 out of it. I know somebody was being facetious or something, but I was looking at the literature in the Wall Street Journal, and somebody remarked it. As far as they know, Guyana got $100,000.
Oh boy. Oh boy.
I know the guy was being facetious or what.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh Lord. If we're not careful, in Guyana, we have all these things that are flying left, right, and center. Really, the truth could be stifled in a real serious way. But we're going to keep the truth alive on this program.
But you know what, David, there is, yes. I think if you have a national oil company, it could be a place becoming like a repository for all kinds of knowledge development and storing, so that then you could really understand the industry, because we don't really understand the industry in the way that CY is possibly the only person now who is giving us a particular kind of insight into the industry. But really and truly, the people who are claiming to be running it, they don't have a full understanding of how the oil industry works.
Oh, the oil industry. We can't close our program without touching on the developments in our sister CARICOM country, Haiti. Very brisk developments there. Goes into what we started to discuss, the whole notion of democracy not democracy in the imperialist way, but democracy in a real serious people's way. And Haiti is really a disaster that has to be fixed. It has to be fixed, and it has to be fixed, I think, in a new way. Professor Thomas, are you encouraged by the outcome of the intervention, the meeting that CARICOM leaders had, and they proposed support for an interim administration in Haiti as a means of setting the stage for proper elections?
The only good thing about that is that I think it's probably a very good thing that the current Prime Minister decided not to go back.
Yes.
Because I think that would be really calamitous. But the fact that the Americans chose him in the first place and persisted in his choice when everybody else in Haiti was calling for them to abandon that course shows the stubbornness and the dysfunction of the Biden administration at this point in time. I think Blinken, I think it was Blinken that went to the summit in Jamaica.
Yes, Blinken was there. Yeah.
And I don't know if they were trying to co-opt Caribbean leaders into the process. But there needs to be a significant shift towards recognizing the legitimacy of some of the domestic forces within Haiti as a means of going on. I don't think at this point in time, with the level of violence and the level of guns out in the street, that it'd be an easy task for CARICOM to regularize the situation and so on, because there'd be too many casualties for the Caribbean region to bear, I think, if they were to turn their arms against the Caribbean police forces or armies if they were sent. So I think that we have to go down keep going down the American route, which has been the source of much disaster.
Yeah. Dennis?
I think it parallels what's happening also.
Yes.
Amazing American errors.
And that anti-American sentiment or the anti-American attitude to Haiti sentiment is very deep among the people of Haiti. Every time I've gone there, you can feel it. You can feel it. It's there. It's not hidden. And I think CARICOM has to be very careful.
Careful.
Yes.
You're not casting that role. They're not seen as puppets.
As puppets of the US. Dennis?
Yeah, and for this reason, the Kenyans are not going. They said categorically that they're not going to go to Haiti to lead any peacekeeping force without a government being in place. And so when the Henry resigned the other day, a few days ago, they said they're not going. But I think that to your question, David, I think that this, like CY said, there isn't much to come out of this. And one of my concerns really has to do with the conditionalities that are imposed there. Because when you look at the document that came out from that meeting, it reminded me of Iraq and the conditionalities about who could participate in the electoral process, who to include and who to exclude. Yeah. And that's you're not going down the right road there at all. Because if you have a criminal record, you can't participate. I would say who without sin cast the first stone in a scenario like that, right?
Yeah.
It's a disaster. How could you have those conditionalities?
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you that it's a very risky undertaking, and the credibility of the
very dangerous too.
Very dangerous. The credibility of the CARICOM leaders are on are on the line here, and they have to be extremely careful. When I looked at the table and I saw, of course, the chairman of CARICOM is our president, but when I look and see he's flanked by Mayor Motley and Ralph Gonzalez, and I reflect on the role they're playing in the Venezuelan issue. If they take that attitude to Haiti, I am very nervous. And I have tremendous respect for Mayor Motley, or intelligence. And when she started out, or bravery in taking up some of these global issues. Of course, Dr. Gonzalez is part of what we call a fellow traveler, but as disappointed in recent times, and really doesn't cut a figure of confidence as we deal with this issue. And then, when we take into consideration, Eric Phillips has written a letter in which they're now lumping indentureship, reparations for indentureship, reparations for colonialism, reparations for genocide against Native Indians, reparations against slavery, all in one basket, and really watering down the whole reparations thing. It's now almost becoming a joke, and you can see the hand of Motley and others there putting indentureship in the whole mix there. And of course there should be reparations for indentureship, but you can't lump it in the same basket here, reparations for chattel slavery and so on. But it's because they want something from Guyana, and this is the kind of what CY and the WPA call the hustling mentality that is taken over.
You see who's supporting him? You see who's supporting that thing? Kit Nascimento is praising it. Say, oh, what a wonderful thing you've done. Lumping.
Well, Kit is Gentlemen, thank you all so much for coming on to yet another edition of Politics 101, or Open Word edition. Again, it's always a pleasure to have your input, Professor Thomas, Professor Dennis Canterbury, both members of the leadership of the WPA. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
And thank you, our audience, for staying with us. It's always good. They'll always say that, we have to break down things for our people. And, when our academics and experts speak, they speak over the head of people. All of you all have stayed through this program and continue to stay through. Our Open Word programs are among the most viewed, constant audience, and it shows our own maturity. I mean, we engage in public education, and the idea of public education is to get our public, and some would say our publics, involved in their own education, what Walter Rodney used to call self-activity, for self-emancipation. There is a way in which our people are deeply involved in these issues. I go back to when I was a boy in Buxton, and the WPA would come in, and I see the cane cutters and the farmers would come out from the back dam when they hear Clive Thomas coming to speak. And we young people, we wanted to hear the energy of Walter Rodney and so on. And I will always wonder why they want to listen to Thomas. Because, of course, 16, 17-year-old, we are not into the economics and stuff. But they were into the economics, because Thomas was talking about political economy. He was talking about sugar. He was talking about peasant farming. And they understood what he was saying. We, the young boys and girls, we weren't there yet, but they were there. And so I reject that idea that when our professionals, our academics speak, they have to water down things for people. Walter Rodney always said when he went into the colleges in Jamaica, he not only thought, but he learned from the Rastafarians. He learned from the inner city people. And we continue to learn from you all, even as you learn from us. Anne wash Anne, make Anne come clean. Love you all. And we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Politics 101.
One race from the same place that make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region. For we women and we children. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean and the Caribbean and the Caribbean.